Before we start the video, make sure to subscribe to our channel, The Forgotten Files. Also, drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. Alright, let's get started. On the night of August 3rd, 1891, a scream tore through the cypress trees of Briar Hollow Plantation. A child's scream, followed by the sound of chains dragging across wooden floors. By sunrise, 3 cabins were empty, their families gone, as if lifted from the earth without struggle. The only trace was a set of small bloody footprints, too small to belong to any grown man, but perfectly matching the boots of the slave owner's 12-year-old son, Elias Wexley. Narrator, ominous, documentary tone. History remembers monsters, but it often forgets the children who became them and the places that allowed their creation. Briar Hollow was a plantation built on secrecy. It was a world where the Wexley family hid their heir from public view, educating him privately, shaping him into something he was never meant to become. Elias was born frail, quiet, with a strange talent for obedience and cruelty woven together like twin vines. When his father fell ill in 1891, Elias, still only 12, was forced into a role no child should occupy. He was given full authority over the plantation. What happened next was whispered from cabin to cabin for generations, but never written. It died with the land, buried under church donations, political influence, and a century of silence. The truth starts with the disappearances. But the real horror began long before that. Inside the house, behind locked doors, where Elias learned a different kind of discipline. The kind that bleeds. The Wexley house was built like a fortress, tall shutters, cold corridors, portraits watching from every angle. The enslaved people always said the windows never blinked, as if the house itself was keeping track of their movements. But the worst window was the one at the far end of the second floor. The one where Elias stood. He spent hours there, silent, pale as candle wax, staring down at the cabins. People said he was studying patterns the way adults study maps. Which families worked hardest? Who spoke to whom? Who limped? Who had a child who cried at night? He watched everything. Mrs. Mabel, the cook, would later recall. That boy didn't see us as people. He watched us the way a hawk watches field mice, patient, calculating, waiting. Elias's father believed discipline created order, so he taught his son methods instead of morals. Every punishment Elias learned came with instructions as meticulous as recipes. How long a person could stand without collapsing, where to strike so the skin bruised but didn't break, how many hours a child could be kept in the quiet room before permanent damage occurred. Elias read these things like scripture. The plantation preacher, Reverend Hollings, claimed he saw Elias once at dawn, whispering through the iron grate of the smokehouse where punishments occurred. Hollings said the boy spoke as though giving instructions to something, or someone, inside. And when Elias turned around, he smiled. Not cruelly, not nervously, just knowingly. The Reverend left Briar Hollow that same afternoon and never returned. Long before Elias took charge, the Wexley family had a ritual for unruly individuals. The quiet room. It sat beneath the smokehouse, a subterranean chamber carved into the earth. No records exist of its construction. Only the whispered belief that it was older than the plantation itself, built by whoever lived on the land before the Wexleys. People said it wasn't built for storage. It was built for containment. The room was cold, always damp, always echoing. Voices didn't travel normally inside it. They folded back onto the person who spoke, making whispers sound like confessions and cries sound like sermons. When Elias was 6, his father made him watch a punishment there. Witnessing suffering, he said, would harden the boy into leadership. But Elias didn't react the way they expected. He didn't cry. He didn't shake. He didn't even blink. He simply tilted his head, slow, curious, listening to the echoes like they were speaking to him. Years later, after Elias became master, he repurposed the room. Not for discipline, for study. And each time someone was sent inside, they came out changed. Some emerged silent and obedient. Others emerged hollow-eyed, whispering things like, "The walls know our names." Elias made me hear myself. Something in that room was already awake. No one knew what he did in there. But every person who entered began to fear him, not as a boy, but as something carved from the dark beneath the plantation. Something that learned early what fear could do. In June 1891, the plantation foreman, Marlowe Briggs, collapsed during a heat wave. He was the last adult Wexley trusted with maintaining discipline. In his absence, the plantation expected chaos. Instead, something else happened. The whip, the tool every overseer carried like a badge, went silent. Elias abolished it overnight. Some thought it was mercy, but the cabins soon learned the truth. When Elias took power, discipline didn't stop. It changed. He walked the fields barefoot, saying he wanted to feel the soil they fear. He memorized every face, every family line, every weakness. He created rules no adult would invent. Punishments given at midnight, not daytime. No one was allowed to speak unless spoken to. Children were held responsible for the mistakes of adults. One mother described him as a quiet storm, a boy who never raised his voice, never shouted threats. His punishments did not rely on force. They relied on psychology. One of his most feared acts was the following, where he walked behind someone for hours, silent, matching their footsteps exactly. People said the fear of his closeness, his breath barely a whisper, drove them to confess things they never did just to make it stop. And then came the disappearances. First a man, then a woman, then an entire family, each gone without noise, without struggle, without explanation, as though Elias had simply collected them. The morning after the first disappearance, the enslaved community woke to a disturbing sight. Bloody footprints leading from cabin 7 to the smokehouse. They were small, child-sized, but not bare. They had the distinct shape of stitched leather boots. Elias's boots. But what terrified them wasn't the blood. It was the direction of the prints. They didn't lead to the quiet room. They led out of it. And something about the spacing was wrong. The steps were too long for a normal child. Too heavy, as if he wasn't walking, but being guided. When the adults questioned him, Elias said he was taking notes. When Reverend Hollings tried to intervene, Elias told him, "You watch the sky. I watch what walks under it." That same week, the Reverend fled town, and the prince reappeared, night after night, always outside the smokehouse, always fresh. Somewhere deep under the earth, beneath stone and soil, something had awakened in the quiet room. And Elias was no longer just observing it. He was learning from it. The first person to break the silence was not an adult. It was a child, 6-year-old Rebecca, daughter of Jonah and Leah from cabin 4. Rebecca had vanished the same night as the family from cabin 7. 3 days later, she appeared again, standing outside the main house at dawn, covered in dust, barefoot, her hair matted like she had crawled through earth. But what unsettled the adults wasn't her condition. It was her expression. Rebecca had always been bright, talkative, curious. The child who hummed while gathering water. The child who always asked questions. But the Rebecca who returned spoke with a calmness that didn't belong to her age. Everyone gathered around her, asking where she had been, whether she was hurt, whether she saw who took her. She looked at them and said, "Elias showed me the other staircase." No one knew what that meant. The Wexley house had only one staircase, the main one in the foyer. When asked where this other staircase was, Rebecca raised her little hand and pointed toward the smokehouse. "It goes down and down and down." The adults didn't believe her, until she described the quiet room with a precision no child should have known. The humid air, the echoing walls, the way voices came back wrong. And then she said something that froze every soul in that yard. He said the room teaches him if he listens long enough. After that, Rebecca refused to enter sunlight. She spent her days crouched in shadows, humming a tuneless melody. And every time someone tried to talk to her, she whispered. Elias said it's almost ready. No one asked what it meant. No one dared. Briar Hollow Plantation kept meticulous records: births, rations, labor logs, punishments. Elias's father believed documentation kept order, so every foreman was trained to maintain the ledger. But in July 1891, the plantation bookkeeper discovered something terrifying. An entire page had been removed. Not torn, not ripped, cleanly cut. The missing page was dated the night of the second disappearance, the night 8 people vanished without a trace. What remained were faint indentations on the next page, pressure marks left by the writing that once existed on the missing sheet. Marlowe Briggs had always been a careful writer, pressing firmly with ink. And if he hadn't died before the vanishings, he would have been the one making the entry. A field hand named Isaiah noticed something others didn't. The indentations weren't from Marlowe's handwriting. They were smaller, sharper, child-sized. When they held the paper to the light, they could make out partial phrases. Descend again, the boy demanded. Not human, voice behind him. And at the very bottom, barely legible, a final impression. The child is not alone in that room. The adults tried to hide the discovery, afraid of what Elias might do if he learned they saw it. But that night, the ledger was found placed neatly on the dining table of the main house, open to the missing page. Elias stood behind it, hands clasped, smiling politely. You looked at something I meant no one to see, he said. The next morning, Isaiah was gone. His cabin door was open. His bed was empty, and the indentations on the ledger were deeper than before. Among all the children on Briar Hollow, 12-year-old Miriam was the most strong-willed. She was one of the few who never feared Elias openly, though she never challenged him either. Her father worked inside the main house, cleaning the upstairs hallways. Miriam often helped him, silently sweeping, listening, observing. She began noticing patterns. Elias left his room every night at 2:13 a.m. He always walked toward the smokehouse, never looking behind him. He always returned at exactly 3:07 a.m., even if storms flooded the fields. Miriam stopped sleeping completely. Instead, she stayed awake, crouched at her cabin window, counting his footsteps across the wooden porch. She told her father that something followed Elias each night. Not a person, not an animal, but a shape. Something tall and thin, moving in ways bones shouldn't allow. Her father begged her to stop watching, fearful Elias would notice. But Miriam kept counting his footsteps. One night, Elias didn't walk alone. He stopped outside her cabin, turned his head, looked directly at her through the darkness, and smiled. Not a warning, a greeting. The next morning, Miriam's father found ashes in a circle outside their cabin, as if something had been burned there. Miriam didn't sleep again, not even for minutes. And when asked why, she only said, "If I sleep, I'll dream what he dreams. And I don't want to see what lives under that house." Word eventually reached the nearest town, Milford, that Briar Hollow needed a doctor. Elias's father had grown weaker, and rumors of strange behaviors from the plantation spread through taverns and church porches. Dr. Alden Rourke arrived on a fog-heavy morning, expecting the usual plantation ailments: exhaustion, infections, injuries. What he found instead was Elias at the door, speaking with a calm authority far beyond his age. "Father is resting. I'll show you where the illness grows." Rourke hesitated. Children didn't give orders, not in respectable households. But he followed. Elias didn't lead him upstairs. He led him out of the house, through the yard, past the cabins, toward the smokehouse. The doctor refused at first, insisting illnesses didn't live underground. But Elias said something that chilled him. "If you don't treat what whispers, it spreads." Rourke stepped inside the smokehouse and nearly gagged. The air was wrong, too cold, too metallic, too thick. He felt as though the walls were pulsing. But the trap wasn't the room. It was the silence. As soon as he spoke, his words echoed back in a voice that was not his own. Rourke ran. He didn't stop running until he reached his carriage. He left his medical bag behind, left his hat, left protocol, left dignity. By the time he returned to town, his face was ghost pale, hands trembling so violently he could not sign his name. He refused to speak of what he saw, but he repeated one sentence for hours. "The boy is learning from something no man should hear." The enslaved community had always kept small oil lamps burning at night. It wasn't just for light, it was protection, symbolic, a way to remind themselves that darkness could not swallow the human soul completely. But on August 2nd, 1891, every lamp on the plantation went out at the exact same moment, 11:33 p.m. No wind, no rain, no footsteps, just a sudden, suffocating darkness. Children screamed. Adults shouted for matches. But the darkness swallowed everything. A deep hum rose from the ground beneath the cabins, like stone grinding. The air thickened. Hearts raced. Some said their ears filled with whispers. And then came the footsteps. Soft, measured, deliberate. Elias walked through the yard, barefoot, holding a single lantern. Its light didn't illuminate like normal fire. It moved strangely, bending as though resisting him. He stopped in the center of the cabins, raised the lantern, and said, "It's ready." No one asked what he meant. No one could breathe long enough to form words. A moment later, the lantern extinguished itself. Darkness swallowed him. When the lamps relit an hour later, without anyone touching them. The first 3 cabins discovered people missing, and the number of footprints leading away from the smokehouse had doubled. 2 days after the lamps went out, a field hand named Samuel found something strange behind the barn. A map, carved into the wooden wall with unnaturally straight lines. Not drawn with charcoal, not scratched with nails. Carved, deep and clean, as if done with a blade sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. But no one heard carving. No one saw anyone near the barn. And Elias had not left the main house that morning. The map was circular, with spiraling rings around a central point. It didn't resemble any layout of the plantation or any place Samuel had ever seen. But when he traced the carving with his finger, he realized something else. The marks were carved from the inside of the wood outward, as if the blade had emerged from within the plank. When Samuel reported it to the others, no one wanted to approach the carving again. Children cried when they got near it. Adults felt pressure in their ears, like the air was too thick. Even animals refused to go close. That night, Elias appeared at the barn door, as if waiting for them to gather. His hands were clean, his clothes spotless, his face calm. "It's not a map," he said. "It's a memory." No one understood. Samuel asked quietly, "Memory of what?" Elias turned his head slowly toward the smokehouse. "Of what was buried before we arrived." The next morning, the carving was gone. Not covered, not sanded. Gone. The plank smooth, as if the wood had grown back over it. Only Samuel remembered the lines. And by sundown, Samuel too had disappeared. One of the enslaved men, Thomas Hargreave, had a cousin who worked in the postal service in Milford. Desperate, terrified, and convinced the plantation was descending into something unholy, Thomas wrote a letter addressed to the governor of the state. He described the disappearances, the strange behavior of Elias, the unnatural sounds beneath the smokehouse, the lamp extinction, the map carved into wood. He knew the letter could cost him his life, but he also believed staying silent would cost everyone else theirs. He secretly gives the sealed letter to a traveling peddler who visited the plantation twice a month. The peddler promised to deliver it to the post office. 3 days later, the peddler returned, white as milk, hands shaking, too scared to enter the cabins. He left the letter on the ground, untouched, and said, "Someone stopped me at the crossroads. A child. He said I forgot something." The letter was unopened, but the seal had been altered, not broken, altered. The wax had shifted into a new shape, like it melted and solidified again on its own. It now bore the image of a downward spiral, the same symbol Samuel saw carved behind the barn. When Thomas opened the letter, expecting his own writing, he found only one sentence written in a child's hand. "No one outside needs to know." That night, the peddler vanished on the road, and Thomas never tried to send another letter again. Old Man Gideon was the oldest living man on the plantation, almost 90, with a memory as fragile as dry leaves. He rarely spoke, but when the disappearances began, he started whispering fragments of stories from decades earlier. He told the adults that Briar Hollow had not always been a plantation. Before the Wexleys arrived, the land was controlled by a group he called the First Ones, though whether he meant settlers, worshippers, or something else entirely, he never clarified. What he did say was that the First Ones did not work the land. They listened to it. Gideon remembered being a child, before enslavement, sneaking near their old meeting grounds. He heard chants, low, rhythmic, ancient, words that weren't English, weren't African, weren't any language he'd ever heard again. But the most important thing he said was this. The First Ones built a chamber underground. Not a room, a throat, a listening place. When adults asked him why he called it a throat, he explained, "Because it speaks back, and whatever hears you, learns you." Gideon insisted the quiet room was part of the old chamber, just the uppermost part. And Elias, he said, was not controlling it. He was being shaped by it. But Gideon's warnings came too late. Within a week, he passed away in his sleep. His burial was simple, but the next morning, his grave was found disturbed. Soil pushed outward, not inward, as if something had crawled out of it. By mid-August, the adults realized Elias's routines were no longer human routines. He no longer ate meals, no longer slept in his bed, no longer carried himself like a child. He spent each dawn standing barefoot in the field with his face turned upward, as if waiting for something descending from the clouds. One morning, Miriam witnessed him standing in the tall grass, arms slightly raised, not in prayer, but in invitation. And then he smiled. Not at the land. Not at the house. Not at the people watching. He smiled at the sky, as though answering a question no one else could hear. Later that day, one of the older women confronted him, asking what he was waiting for. Elias replied, "They're almost done." "Who?" she demanded. He did not blink, did not breathe, did not hesitate. "The voices beneath us. They're building the staircase." She backed away, horrified. Elias added, "When it reaches the surface, you'll all see what I've been learning." That night, the earth vibrated beneath the cabins, soft at first, then stronger, as though stones were shifting under the ground. The vibration lasted 7 minutes. 7 minutes of rattling pots, trembling walls, and muffled cries from the children. 7 minutes of something beneath them moving. When it stopped, the ground exhaled a warm breath, and everything went silent. A woman named Ruth, quiet, disciplined, rarely frightened, became the first adult to hear the second voice. It happened while she washed clothes by the creek at dusk. The forest around her was still, too still. No insects, no birds. Even the water seemed to slow. She heard soft footsteps behind her. Elias again, she thought. But when she turned, no one was there. The footsteps continued anyway. Then came a voice. Not a whisper, not a breath. A layered voice, like several tones speaking at once. It spoke from the trees, from the water, from the ground. It said her name, not screamed, not threatened, just spoke it, as if tasting the sound. Ruth ran, clothes falling from her hands, lungs burning, legs shaking. When she reached the cabins, everyone saw the change immediately. Her hair had turned streak white at the roots. Her pupils were dilated, swallowing almost all the color. She trembled violently as she tried to speak. "It's talking to more than just Elias. It knows all our names. It's climbing." But the worst thing she said, the thing that silenced the entire yard, was this. "I heard it breathe, and it breathed like a child." That night, Ruth barricaded her cabin door. By morning, the door was still locked from the inside. But Ruth was gone. Every window was intact, every board unbroken. Yet she was gone. And on the inside of the door, carved perfectly neat, was a new symbol, a downward spiral. By late August, strange sounds were heard beneath the smokehouse nightly. Thuds, scraping, and the faint echo of footsteps heavier than any human child could make. Miriam, unable to sleep for weeks, finally peered through a crack in the floorboards and saw it. A staircase of stone, spiraling downward, pushing upward from the earth beneath the quiet room. The spiral was impossibly tight and unnaturally smooth. Water dripped along the edges, yet it didn't corrode the stone. Elias stood at the top, small hands resting on the railing that wasn't there. He seemed neither excited nor afraid. He simply waited. And then came the whispers. Low at first, like wind through reeds. Then louder, layered voices, each distinct, speaking at once. They echoed from the staircase itself. Miriam tried to tell the adults, but no one wanted to approach. Every floorboard in the smokehouse seemed to hum with anticipation, a resonance that made their teeth ache. The children, who had followed Elias's routines out of fear, started disappearing into the spiral. Slowly, voluntarily, whispering to something unseen. By midnight, all that remained was Elias, standing at the top, smiling at the stone that had emerged from the earth, as if it had been waiting for him. One night, Elias ordered everyone to gather in the main hall. No one dared disobey. He did not sit at the head of the table, though the adults expected him to. Instead, he walked slowly down the table, observing each face, counting, memorizing. He spoke for the first time in weeks. "We are ready." Then he handed each person a plate. Empty, transparent, yet heavy, impossibly heavy. When anyone reached for food, their hands passed through it, yet they could feel it. Cold, grainy, sticky, like ash from centuries-old fires. Some of the older adults began whispering prayers, while children trembled silently. No one dared to ask what the plates were for. Elias leaned back, watching. "Everything you've known about this house, about me, is preparation," he said. "Now you see, and those who cannot see will leave." At that moment, the plates seemed to grow heavier. Some adults collapsed under their weight. Some children disappeared into the air as if swallowed. By the end of the night, only a few remained conscious, staring at Elias's calm, cold expression. The house itself seemed to sigh. Something in the walls shifted. The quiet room hummed as though satisfied. Those who survived the final night could never explain the sounds beneath the house. Floorboards groaned in response to human movement, but also in response to thoughts. Some reported hearing their deepest fears spoken aloud before they even formed words. Elias moved freely across the boards, unafraid. He seemed tethered to the vibrations, listening to the hidden voices that spoke through the planks, through the stone, through the earth itself. The adults realized too late that the quiet room was a conduit. It connected the living to something older, something beneath the land that had observed centuries pass. And Elias was the only one able to interpret it, the only one who could command it without being destroyed. By dawn, some floors had caved into unseen spaces below. Others were blackened as if charred, yet no fire existed. The smell of damp, iron-heavy air lingered for weeks. And the villagers who walked near the plantation in the following months swore they could hear faint whispers echoing into the woods, always calling a child's name. By September, the Wexley family records ended abruptly. Father, mother, any remaining children, gone. Some said they had fled town. Others whispered that the house had claimed them, as it had claimed the others. Elias, now barely recognizable as a child, became a legend whispered among surrounding communities. Adults who ventured near Briar Hollow reported flickering shadows in the windows, though no one lived there. Footprints appearing and disappearing in the mud. Small hands watching from upper-story windows at dawn. Those who investigated were never seen again. The plantation's land was eventually sold and abandoned. Trees grew over the cabins. Stone steps crumbled beneath ivy. But the locals maintained a single rule: never enter Briar Hollow after dark. Stories persisted of a child with a strange mastery over the living and the dead. A child who had learned from something beneath the ground. A child who became the heir to a darkness older than the Wexleys themselves. By the turn of the century, Briar Hollow Plantation was a ghost. Children avoided its paths. Adults crossed themselves when they mentioned it. The story of Elias Wexley became folklore, buried in oral tradition, but traces remain. Footprints in fields long overgrown. Whispers caught in the wind near the smokehouse. The occasional report of a child-shaped shadow standing atop a hill, staring at the sky. Historians who attempt to document the plantation find only fragments, ledger pages, half-burned letters, faint depressions in soil. But some clues remain. Elias Wexley did not die. Elias Wexley did not age. And the quiet room waits. Every generation that listens carefully reports faint murmurs from the soil, a voice calling names, teaching, shaping, waiting. And the chilling truth lingers. Briar Hollow never belonged to the Wexleys. It belonged to the child. It belonged to what he learned from beneath. And it still listens. Do not go near the land, the old villagers warn. The child watches. And he remembers. The camera pans upward to the empty hill where the house once stood. The wind moves strangely, carrying whispers, faint, layered, patient. By the turn of the century, Briar Hollow Plantation was a ghost. Children avoided its paths. Adults crossed themselves when they mentioned it. The story of Elias Wexley became folklore, buried in oral tradition, but traces remain. Footprints in fields long overgrown. Whispers caught in the wind near the smokehouse. The occasional report of a child-shaped shadow standing atop a hill, staring at the sky. Historians who attempt to document the plantation find only fragments, ledger pages, half-burned letters, faint depressions in soil. But some clues remain. Elias Wexley did not die. Elias Wexley did not age. And the quiet room waits. Every generation that listens carefully reports faint murmurs from the soil, a voice calling names, teaching, shaping, waiting. And the chilling truth lingers. Briar Hollow never belonged to the Wexleys. It belonged to the child. It belonged to what he learned from beneath. And it still listens. Do not go near the land, the old villagers warn. The child watches. And he remembers. The camera pans upward to the empty hill where the house once stood. The wind moves strangely, carrying whispers, faint, layered, patient. Fade to black. Yindi.